Hello, sculpture students. The following slideshow is an introduction to the history of sculpture as a medium in the fine arts. First, I just want to have a slide of drawing because before we get into sculpture, I think it's good to understand that most and all art really was born from drawing or from the cave. And you can see here in the Kosker Cave, the Upper Paleolithic time, some already really detailed and extremely dynamic drawing that was done probably by torchlight. So you can really see that we as humans have been making art, recognizing beauty, and of course trying to represent it in our way and express certain types of symbolism or narrative, or in this case, probably an educational mapping of different types of animals throughout the generations or however long people were drawing in this cave. But let's go to the definition here. Drawing. In the most basic sense, to draw means to pull, push, or drag a marking tool across a surface to leave a line or a mark. Most people working in the visual arts utilize drawing as a major tool for visual thinking or recording and developing ideas. Drawing is an immediate and accessible way to communicate through imagery. Through drawing, we can share ideas, feelings, experiences, and imaginings. Sometimes a drawing does several of these things simultaneously. About 30,000 years ago, art entered a rich and sophisticated phase. Many of the images painted on the walls of caves in southern France and northern Spain were painted between 28 to 10,000 BC. And actually, just to intervene here, we're finding drawing existed long before that, 60 to 80,000 BC actually. Information is being updated constantly and new discoveries are found. The earliest known site of prehistoric cave paintings in Europe was discovered in December 1994 near Vaillon-Pont-d'Arc, excuse my French, in southern France, in an impressive trove of hundreds of animals and bird paintings. As you can see here, again, this image of the Kosker Cave in France. The cave contains various prehistoric rock art engravings, which was discovered in 1985 and by and named after diver Henry Kosker. So the person that discovered was a diver. And a lot of these caves, you have to go in through a submerged cave or tunnels because back then these caves were not at the same sea level as they are now. So it's a very dangerous thing to go do or to discover. But its existence was not made public until 1991 when 3 divers became lost in the cave and died. So that's when it really was open to the public, or more research went in because of the tragedy there. But again, just before we go on, drawing, the most important and the most foundational aspect of making all art, and especially with sculpture. So all the sculptures that we're going to be seeing, you can bet that there were large amounts of drawing in order to design, or in order to figure out how to express our idea in these materials that we're about to see. So always when we're trying to sculpt and we're trying to learn how to sculpt, drawing is key. So drawing should go hand in hand with the process of thinking about or learning about sculpture. So here we have Michelangelo's unfinished sculptures, or they were intentionally unfinished slave sculptures. Here we can see how the figure is immersing out of the stone as if it's captive. So it's a lot of things going on here with a sculpture like this. It was a statement, almost a social political statement of being in such an environment where you probably had a large labor force, and Michelangelo, being a stone sculptor, really saw that in the quarries of Italy at the time. So it's a lot of things. This was done at a later age as well. So he was older and wiser, and of course a lot more famous, and had the ability to make more expressive work because of how much work he had done for the church and for the Vatican and the Medici family. That was a big family at the time. And remember, you can always click on the images and click on the names, and you can really go into the rabbit hole of finding more information on these pieces of art and a lot more detailed photos, and a lot of online museums are interactive, and the links that I have here are interactive. So go ahead and do that, because it's a great thing to go into the history of art and sculpture, especially because of just how cool it is, and the amazing feats that people have accomplished throughout the history to create our civilization. But let's go to the definition here. Sculpture. Sculpture is one of the oldest and most enduring of all the arts. All the types of sculpture, including carving, modeling, casting, construction, and assemblage, and earthworks, employ two basic processes. They are either subtractive or additive in nature. In subtractive processes, the sculpture begins with a mass of material larger than the finished work. So, for instance, you can just see the mass of the stone of the Michelangelo Atlas piece here. So there's always some material that an artist has to deal with, has to step up to, whether it's fabric, whether it's soil, whether it's wood, the tree. So a mass always exists first. It begins with a mass of material larger than the finished work and removes material or subtracts from that mass until the work achieves its finished form. Carving is a subtractive process. In additive processes, the sculptor builds the work, adding material as the work proceeds. Modeling, construction, and assemblage are additive processes. So, we really do also resort a lot of our definition of sculpture to clay and getting a malleable or plastic material and stacking it on top. So that's what modeling is. So you have your two basic kind of subjects here of sculpture, your additive and your subtractive. So casting, in which material in a liquid state is poured into a mold or allowed to harden, has additive aspect, but as we shall see, it is in many ways a process of its own. Land art often utilizes both additive and subtractive processes. So I just wanted to kind of land some definitions of some basic elements of sculpture, your additive, your subtractive, your modeling, your casting, and of course, all this can lead to massive pieces of art in land art, that like we have known about from Inca cultures and obviously things that we've seen in ancient civilizations from Aztec, Mayan, all the way to Greek and Roman. So, sculpture is a large subject. It is historically the anchor of everything that we are as human. So the slideshow won't go into all that detail, but hopefully just touch on some of these main columns of that hold up the definition of sculpture. Here in this next slide, we have the first and probably the most natural way of sculpting, which would be subtractive. Whether we're digging in the ground, making an interesting shape, whether you're a child with a stick digging into the grass, you're taking something away from a material. So subtractive is really a good starting point for a lot of these processes. And we have here another rebellious slave, unfinished or intentionally unfinished piece by Michelangelo, 1513. And you can see how you have a contrast of texture and of course the reality or the realism of the flesh, and just how amazingly detailed and amazingly accurate it is. But again, all that adds to some drama. But it's still subtractive. It was still a person, a Michelangelo, chiseling away at material, and then eventually the chisel gets smaller, and then you're into some sanding, and marble is actually a pretty soft material. That these things can happen, and of course you have thousands of years of people doing this, of humans doing this. So eventually it reaches an apex or a peak, like what Michelangelo did, and the rest of the Renaissance artists, such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, when it comes to this type of figurative work. In the background here, we have a contemporary or more modern artist named Jesus Morales, who did carving, but in a more Aztec Mayan kind of tradition of patterns and geometry. But instead of using soft marbles, he used hard granite. So it's a different type of process and a different type of look and a whole different type of feel when you are looking at granite versus marbles. But just different types of ways of subtracting material, and in these cases, some of the hardest materials that our planet can give us, stone. Let's go to the definition here. Subtractive. The subtractive process allows us to make things not only or not by adding or attaching, but counterintuitively by removing material. To create a figure in stone, stone carvers chip from the block all the stone that is not the figure, leaving behind only the material that resembles the figure they wish to make. Michelangelo imagined a figure within the block and believed his task was simply to release it. Michelangelo's unfinished captive from his series of unfinished slaves is a good example of making by subtraction, because he left the remnants of the marble block intact, clearly illustrating the relationship of stone block and the carving process to the imprisoned figure. You know, so uh, you know, subtractive processes is a natural way of thinking about form and shape, and it is something that we do abstractly as well. We do that when we are looking at the clouds. As a child, you look at the clouds and you are seeing something. You are subtracting a certain type of shapes and tones and colors, and you are seeing an image in the clouds. So it's almost instinctual for us to utilize that concept of subtracting material to find something within. It's also philosophical, subtracting certain types of ideas or thoughts in order to achieve more new or better thoughts, and so on. So subtractive is a very important and foundational concept of making sculpture. Next, we have relief and in the round, which are two processes that are or have been widely used throughout historical aspects of making sculpture. Here on the far right side, we have Chefren, which is an ancient sculpture from 2500 BC, Egyptian, made out of diorite, and its height is about 66 inches. So a large, heavy, dense piece of material here, and diorite is a extremely hard material. It is not it's harder than the granites that we're used to. It's going into your basalts and your more glass-like stones. So just in that sense in itself is an amazing feat and an amazing image because of how difficult it is to create a sculpture like this, and with such form and detail. But it is a great example of what in the round is. Eventually, human beings got into understanding that more power can exist in a sculpture visually if you start to get things off the wall and and have the ability to walk around them, which then challenges your existence in general. You as a human being, and a creation or a sculpture challenges your existence in your three-dimensional space that we all live in. But let's go into the small paragraph next to it. It says, apart from its architectural achievement, the chief glories of Egyptian art during the Old Kingdom and later are the portrait statues recovered from funerary temples and tombs. So, of course, all these pieces here, or these two pieces here, are from tombs of pharaohs that have been sealed up and that were discovered in the 20th, 18th, and 20th century. One of the finest is that of Chefren from the Valley Temple of his pyramid. Carved of diorite, a stone of extreme hardness, it shows the king enthroned with the falcon of the god Horus enfolding the back of the head with its wings. These sculptures here were made because they had a belief that when the spirit or the soul or the ka of the body, how they described it, left the body, it needed a other place or another body to reside in. And these materials here were believed to be so hard and so old and so mystic that they were proper containers to have the pharaoh spirit live in for eternity, or a place or a new home. So that's why they were made out of these materials, because again they were almost like vessels, spiritual vessels, which is very interesting. Let's go into the definition here of relief and in the round. In addition to those processes, there are three basic ways in which we experience sculpture in three-dimensional space: as relief, in the round, and as an environment. Among the great masters of relief sculpture were the Egyptians, who often decorated the walls of their temples and burial complexes with intricate raised relief sculpture, most of which was originally painted. Like the Egyptians, the Greeks used the sculptural art as relief as a means to decorate and embellish the beauty of their great architectural achievements. So a good example of relief sculpture is this Senwar set, one led by Atum to Amen-Re, Again, I might be not the best a vocalist for that type of language, but we can see here what we all have seen probably before is the relief sculpture traditional hieroglyphics of Egypt. But again, we have to look at it more so as a means of communication that was used for a long time, thousands of years. In this day and age, we don't really have a lot of this way of communicating with the masses or with each other or our historical or cultural values or whatever it is that we want to express ourselves. We have different types of digital media or whatever we have now. But for thousands of years, this was the norm. This is how the humans utilized their environment to record history and to record narrative and stories, laws, and everything. So we have to really look at it as a historical record that was used for thousands of years, which really relied upon the sculptor's hand, the sculptor's eye, and the sculptor's skill to create these pieces that would last millennia, thousands of years. And that's what's interesting about sculpture in general is that the permanency of it, the fact that these pieces here will outlast our civilization and the next civilization. And they're super difficult to destroy or super difficult to do anything to, and that's why they've lasted this long. So sculpture really goes into some time concepts that are beyond, I think, a human's capability of understanding. But that's what makes making sculpture interesting, is because you can do that as well as an art student. You can, at this level, already make things that can last thousands and thousands of years. Next, we have a gallery slide of definition or a good example of what low relief is. The fragment from the frieze or sculptural band on the Parthenon, and you can click on that link to get more information or get a visual of what the Parthenon was, a magnificent early civilization, a building, massive. So take a look at that link. On the Parthenon, called the Maidens and Stewards, projects only a little distance from the background and no sculptural element is detached entirely from it. It is thus still considered a low relief. So in comparison to the relief that we just saw in the previous slide, this is a much more detailed, a much more three-dimensional relief. It's not hieroglyphic. It's not as flat as the Egyptians. We're moving more into a Greek aesthetic. Again, remember Egyptian is pre-Greek, so we're going a little bit later in time, but still very ancient. We see here a low relief sculpture, beautifully done, that still has movement, and the drapery of that of the clothing that they're wearing really does fall and hang over those shoulders, but still it's within a two-dimensional plane. It's set in a two-dimensional plane. Again, these were largely made on the way up high on the temple naves, which is on top of the columns, right? Before you hit the roof, you have these large kind of areas that were decorated with these types of reliefs. So take a look at that Parthenon link there so you can take a good look at what I'm talking about. But then again, very effective, and the shadow work that is created really helps the viewer that is on the street, on the maybe 30, 40 feet below. You can still make out the image and make out the information, the narrative. And as the day changes, the narrative changes, the drama changes because of the shadow is changing. So you can really see how these were amazing things to sit and stare at the time, especially in a time where this is where the masses gathered, and this is the information that the masses had towards their history. Instead of having books and instead of having what we have now, they had sculpture. So again, that's why the permanency aspect is there with the material that they use, because this is what everybody used in order to understand their history and their narrative, and of course guided by what the hierarchy wanted them to know. So yes, low relief here, a beautiful way of making interesting narrative inset within a two-dimensional plane. Again, was a formula used for thousands of years of our human civilization. In this next gallery slide, we have a good example of high relief, which is titled Atlas Bringing Hercules, the Golden Apples. And you can see how eventually the forms and the figures are coming out of the two-dimensional plane more and more. Again, this is a very old piece, 470 BCE, but not nearly as old as the 2500 year BC Egyptian piece. But again, getting a lot more detailed and a lot more naturalistic or figurative representational. But let's go to the story that we are seeing here that is being depicted. By contrast, from the Egyptian reliefs, Atlas bringing Hercules the golden apples from the temple of Zeus at Olympia is an example of high relief. Here, the figures project from the background at least half their circumference, and other elements like the left arm of Atlas, the right hand figure, float free. It depicts the moment in the story of Hercules when the giant Atlas returns to the Hesperides with the golden apples of immortality. In Atlas's absence, Hercules had assumed the giant's normal task of holding up the heavens on his back, assisted by a pillow that rests upon his shoulders. In the relief, his protectress, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, helps Hercules to support the weight of the sky so that he can exchange places with Atlas. The frontality of Athena's body is countered by the pure profile of her face, a profile repeated in the positioning of both Hercules and Atlas. Compared to the Egyptian relief sculpture, Olympia seems highly naturalistic. Still, the composition of this relief is dominated by right angles, and as a result, it is stiff and rigid. If the urge to naturalism realized, for instance, in the figure, if Hercules is as burdened by tradition as Hercules himself weighed down. So, you can see, how, that last statement is burdened by tradition as Hercules himself is weighed down. It's interesting because you can see how eventually how art evolves, or how we depict the human. He starts to evolve, and it evolves differently from different parts of the world. At the same time, the Incas were building massive, super hard, super large structures, and the Mayans were eventually doing the same thing. And even in the southwestern United States, the Hopi and the Chaco Canyon people in New Mexico, and that area, they were building some major structures as well. So eventually, just this involvement and how art at this part of the country, or this part of the world in the Greek era, started to get more natural, started to want to depict the human body as perfect and as idealistic as possible. So that's an interesting statement at the end, how this metaphor here of Atlas returning to hold the heavens up, away from Hercules, because Hercules sees all this as a burden. So great metaphor for the how art evolves eventually, and how we will see how it evolves even to our current time. So in the next slide, we have good examples of eventually how the Greek era and art in general started working in the round, where no longer are they um, um, suspended on a two-dimensional wall or immersing out of a two-dimensional wall. It is purely spiraling into a three-dimensional full form that one could experience, by walking around it. So we have excellent examples of art historical sculpture here by Giovanni de Bologna, the rape of the Sabine women, and Bathsheba here. And all these forms and these compositions here are based off of the spiral. So it's even more interesting and amazing when you look at these sculptures and try to find the spiral motion or the spiral line from, for instance, with the rape of the Sabine women here. You can start off with that centered spiral at the very top of that hand, and then how it then leads to the face of the woman, and then to the head of the man, and then down to the hand, and then just continue to spiral. And you can really see how amazing this was when it was made. And still to this day, these are pretty dynamic and beautiful pieces here that really show the how far the naturalism, how artists took, and how far the naturalism went, and how the artist was doing their best to try to create, the more, as much as natural form as they could possibly sculpt. And for instance, here with the Bathsheba woman here, we just see everything just in motion, even though it's a static sculpture. You as a viewer will look at this piece and hear the sounds and possibly hear the environment of this creation here and continue to discover new things with the narrative and make up own things in the narrative in your own subconscious. So you can really see how still to this day it's a dynamic and beautiful work, and just imagine how it was at the time when these were created. But let's go to the definition here of in the round. Perhaps because the figure has traditionally been one of the chief subjects of sculpture, movement is one of the defining characteristics of the medium. Even in relief sculptures, it is as if the figures want to escape the confines of their base. Sculpture in the round literally demands movement. It is meant to be seen from all sides, and the viewer must move around it. Giovanni de Bologna's The Rape of the Sabine Women is impossible to represent in a single photograph. As if this figure spiral, the sculpture changes dramatically as the viewer walks around it and experiences it from each side. It is in part the horror of the scene that lends the sculpture its power, for it draws us around it. In order to see more of what's happening, it involves us both physically and emotionally in the scene it depicts. So, it's hitting you emotionally. It's very hitting you in an amazement of material and technique and skill. So, just true power. But of course, a lot of that is because you can walk around it and it competes with your own physical space. In the round, where we most of us we kind of define sculpture, understand sculpture in this way. But it's interesting to see how it evolved from the wall, from the cave, that of those Chauveau caves that we saw in an earlier slide from France. How it evolved eventually into this peak of naturalism. In the gallery slide here, we have different examples of in the round, from more modern era sculpture from the 20th century by artist David Smith. This one specifically called Blackburn, Song of an Irish Blacksmith. And there's two views here because, eventually artists started to move away from the naturalism, and because that existed for, hundreds or, even thousands of years, so artists eventually didn't want to continue to compete against, naturalism. It had already been done. It had already been exhausted. So naturally, artists started to look at other continents and other cultures for inspiration, more specifically African and Nigerian art, with that abstraction, and of course what was happening in the Americas early on with the Mayas and the Incas. So you can see artists like Picasso and, for instance, David Smith here really taking a more subconscious or abstract way of approaching sculpture in the round. But still dynamic and still interesting, because you're not confined with the long tradition of the figure and the long tradition of how excellent the naturalism is and how the detail is. There's a lot of confinement to that. There's a lot of weight on that, and it doesn't allow for a lot of freedom of expression. So naturally artists started to move away from that, especially during the Industrial Revolution, when metal and steel and different materials started to be accepted or used more for sculpture. David Smith's a good example here. Let's take a look at the statement here, or the paragraph. Look at from different points of view, David Smith's Blackburn, Song of an Irish Blacksmith appears to be two entirely different works of art. The frontal view is airy and open, the work seeming to float in space like a series of notes and chords, while the profile view reveals the sculpture as densely compacted. A confusing jumble of forms form from which two seem to want to escape, one at the top left, the other on the extreme right. The frontal view is almost symmetrical, the profile view radically asymmetrical. So, we can definitely see how sculpture eventually, or how we see shape or form or trees or anything in existence does change as you walk around it. And sculptors use that a lot as an avenue for different types of things that can occur when you make a sculpture, when you pay attention to different positioning of the human body or the viewer when you start to pay attention to how the viewer reacts, how the viewer walks around. How can you play with the one angle versus the next angle? And again, all because you have more freedom in the round. In the next slide here, we have carving, which is just the same as subtractive art, but culturally, carving is different. It's expressed differently in different cultures than it is, for instance, in Europe and with stone. For In other cultures and areas of the world, wood was a sacred and a gift from the land that was used for survival and used for all different types of things, and eventually for art and spiritual representation and symbolism. So, for instance, in the Northwest Native cultures uh, of 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 the centuries past, which goes all the way back, they say 20,000 years. I think that a lot of the oldest relics or artifacts we have shows that Northwest Native cultures have been in the area for a long, long, long time. And wood, different from marble or stone, doesn't last as long. So a lot of the artifacts that we do have, or the reason why we don't have as many artifacts, is because wood was the primary um, medium versus stone and marble and all that stuff that was happening in Egypt and Europe and Rome and Greek era. So here we have examples by Bill Reed here, a good example by Bill Reed, The Raven and the First Man. Again, remember you can click on the images and the names here to get more information. But we have a beautiful large yellow cedar carving that depicts the beginning or the birth of man from the Haida tribe in the Canadian Northwest area, the Haida tribe. That's their belief of how humans were birthed or how creation was made. Very, for instance, similar to the Christian Adam and Eve story. But let's go to the carving definition here. Carving is a subtractive process in which the material being carved is chipped, gouged, or hammered away from an inert raw block of material. Wood and stone are the two most common carving materials. Both materials represent problems for the artist to solve. Sculptors who work in wood must pay attention to the wood's grain, since wood will only split in a direction it grew. To work against the grain is destroying the block. In Northwest Native cultures, house posts and screens were frequently carved and painted with images relating to mythological tales. The northern homes were overburdened with a profusion of carved images, and in addition to the screen and posts, there were numerous decorated articles which littered the rooms. And that's what's great about the Northwest Native art is they carved everything. Interestingly, everything that they used, they had a design or an animal spirit that merged with it. So they're from spoons to bowls, everything was designed and very symmetrically done. That's the characteristic of a lot of Northwest Native art, is that it's exactly the same on one side and the next, almost to the sometimes to the centimeter. So very accurate, and of course their excellent canoe building skills from these great old growth wood, ancient cedar trees, and just how in harmony they were with the forest, and how they just use these massive trees almost in such an environmental way where they would use them and not hurt or kill the trees. That only the canoes that they used were from downed ancient old trees that were already toppled. So just again, click on these images and get some more info on that, because it is a great, great tradition and a masterfully well done woodwork that is not compared to in any other culture on the planet. So carving more as a statement towards a whole cultural tradition, much like stone, wood was taken as seriously and as mastered on this side of the world. In this next gallery slide here, we have carving again, and just another examples of some close-ups of some totem poles and some outdoor decor that was outdoor a Kwakatool village here. So a close-up of just one of the totems that were attached to of the longhouses that they lived in, and you can really see how the line is so well done. and very clean and very accurate. And even this piece of wood here, or this totem here, is decades old at this time here, very well preserved, because cedar does withstand the elements pretty well, but eventually does erode. It's not a stone. But you can see how the line is almost like a calligraphy, because the form line that they use here was a language, and it is supposed to be read like how you would read language or writing, except you're following line and you're following curves and contours. And this language here, or the style here, and how well it's done, and how large of a geographical area it exists in, tells us that it is an ancient language. In order for the frog to be characterized and stylized like this in the mouth of the bear and the paw, it takes a long time for a culture to develop this type of complex imagery. So that in itself, with the abstraction, it's not looking at a body and mimicking it. It's going into a deeper abstracted place, and symbolizing every animal and that you live around. So definitely a masterful work in wood. Here on the other side here we have the Tlingit version of a squatting bear, and it's definitely a language and a tradition and a story, which is very similar to what we're looking at with the naturalistic Greek and era stuff. There's still a story here, just like the story of the rape of the Samoan women. There's a narrative here, and let's go into it. Carving as language. One such tale was that of Bear Mother. In this, a young woman was taken to the home of the bears as punishment for insulting them. She married the bear's chief's son and gave birth to two semi-human cubs. Although this tale originated among the Tishaman, it spread from there to other language group. A painted Tlingit version of the squatting bear on a high nahin, or house partition screen. An oval opening at the base of this screen provided access to the sacred room at the rear of the chief sheikh's house at Rangel. So that's a specific place. So you can definitely hyperlink that and see where that takes you. The bear shown is the brown bear clan crest of chief sheikhs, and is a magnificent example of Tlingit relief carving. And there is a hyperlink there that you can go and see which part of the country I'm talking about here, and go deeper into it. But you're looking at a large piece of wood here, right? That was basically the doorway, the nahin, right? The doorway into your house. So imagine growing up and that being normal. The entering of this symbol, the entering of this a mythological story, and that is being what you're used to, and that's what you think about, and in your subconscious, just like how we have normalities in our everyday life. So it's always interesting to think of what was normal back then in comparison to what was normal now. But in itself, a beautiful carving, and again, taking wood and symbolism and form and line to a whole different level for thousands and thousands of years. Here up next, we have modeling. And modeling is easily explained as taking a plastic material such as clay and pushing it around and trying to investigate the shadows and forms and textures that is created with that pushing and pulling of the plastic material. And here we have a good example of a good studio shot here of Robert Arneson in 1978, working on these self-portraits that he did of himself in all various positions, almost like this um, um, a combination of this classical portraiture, because he would put these on large columns, but done in this what would be called this the California funk style, and that was an era of ceramic artists that was taking place in the 60s and the 70s that really kind of elevated ceramics into this expressive a medium away from a lot of the utilitarian or pots or that kind of ceramic ware that was happening for thousands of years. So, artists like Robert Arneson brought the ceramic or clay medium into the art museum next to how a sculptor or a painter would be celebrated. So here again, a 1978 photo of the artist in his studio. And down on below, we have an interesting piece that he created titled Diet Cola, which is simply just a kind of a expressive, almost cartoonish representation of a six-pack of a mass-produced product. And here we have, it says, Robert Arneson's Diet Cola is a ceramic sculpture. The rough, handmade quality of Arneson's work, a quality that clay lends itself to especially well, contrasts dramatically with his subject matter, mass-produced consumer products. He even allowed the work to crack by firing it too quickly. The piece stands in stark difference to the assembly line. So it's almost like a statement, especially in the era that something like artists like Arneson grew up during the 40s and 50s, and then of course maturing into the 70s and 80s. But this mass-produced celebration of the automobile, suburbia, and all the products that came out of that era really, was analyzed by artists such as Andy Warhol with the pop art movement, and of course with Robert Arneson here, and making a statement towards the mass produce, at what point is an object not handmade anymore? Do people appreciate that handmade quality or that expressive quality when they're completely surrounded by mass produced consumerist products, right? So it's an interesting statement utilizing modeling. Let's go to the definition over here. Modeling. When you pick up a handful of clay, you almost instinctively know what to do with it. You smack it with your hand, pull it, squeeze it, bend it, pinch it between your fingers, roll it, slice it with a knife, and shape it. Then you grab another handful, repeat the process, and add it to the first, building a form piece by piece. These are all basic gestures in the additive process modeling, in which a plastic substance, usually clay, is modeled. Clay, a natural material found worldwide, has been used by artists to make everything from pots to sculpture since its earliest times. Its appeal is largely due to its capacity to be molded into forms and retain their shape. Once formed, the durability of the material can be ensured by firing it, that is, baking it, at temperatures normally ranging between 1200 to 270 degrees Fahrenheit or 2700 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really hot. That's almost a bright orange yellow heat, or an oven. Designed especially for the process. So a kiln is definitely different from an oven. It's definitely a ceramic kiln used to fire high temperatures. This causes it to become hard and waterproof. And we all call that ceramics, and that's what ceramics is once a piece has been fired, a clay piece has been fired and glazed, it's no longer clay. It's completely changed into the ceramic, almost archival material that can last, like we've seen with a lot of historical ancient relics and sculptures, thousands of years. And here we have a gallery slide of modeling, and which is a good example of how modeling has taken on epic levels. So, from the last artist Arneson to, the Shi Hung Ti tomb of the emperor, the 5,000 terracotta Chinese warriors that were found accidentally, they were found, shows how modeling clay and something that's simple. These are all hand pinch pot technique, like how you make a hollow pot, same kind of technique, just into figurative forms, and how far they took a modeling process with clay and fire these clay. So, look at these images. Every warrior has a different face, a different expression, has an individual. There are over 5,000 they found so far, or sorry, 6,000 they found so far, and they're continually to excavate this site, and I think they're finding more and more. Everything from horses to artifacts to carriages, weapons, all made out of clay. You can just imagine the things that we haven't found yet, that are still kind of yet to be discovered, and to show examples on how this process called modeling just simple plastic material like clay, how serious it's been taken, and how in this situation it was to protect or to lead an emperor into the netherworld with his army. So let's read the paragraph here. Throughout history, the Chinese have made extraordinary ceramic works, including the finest porcelains of fine, pure white clay. We tacitly acknowledge their expertise when we refer to our own best dinner plates as china. But the most massive art was discovered in 1974 when well diggers who accidentally drilled into a tomb of Shi Hung Ti, the first emperor of China in 2021 BC, Shi Hung Ti united the country under one rule imposed order, establishing a single code of law and requiring the use of a single language. Under his rule, the Great Wall was built, and construction of his tomb required a force of over 700,000 men. So, just imagine the force that you can, or the things you can do with that much power. Shi was buried near the central Chinese city of Xi'an, or Shen, the origin name of China, and his tomb contained more than 6,000 life-size and extraordinarily lifelike ceramic figures of soldiers and horses, immortal bodyguards for the emperor. More recently, clerks, scribes, and other court figures have been discovered, as well as a set of magnificent bronze horses and chariots. Compared to Arneson's rough work, the artist that we saw on the previous slide, the figures created by the ancient Chinese masters are incredibly refined, but between the two of them, we can see how versatile clay is as a material. So, again, an epic example of the use of modeling, and the previous artist, Robert Arneson, an individual expressive use of the ceramic modeling, or just the use of the technique of modeling in general. In this next slide, we have casting, which is typically done after modeling. So, once a sculptor models a form out of clay, and it's a very simplified statement, but initially you would probably have a skeletal structure out of wood or wire, and then that would be covered with, which is called an armature, and that would be covered with clay, and you would model that and shape it. And then you would do a process in order to cast it in another material. And historically, the material of choice has been bronze, as we all know. And here are some great examples of some really early bronze pieces, just to show how during the Bronze Age, how far they took the technical ability to manipulate bronze, and also it allowed for sculptors to work in series, so you can have more than one of the pieces. You can cast these, so it almost became a medium that allowed more people to be exposed to some of the beautiful forms and shapes of artists' work. So, for instance, like this piece here, the Veiled Dancer, which is from the Hellenistic period. So go ahead and click on that link to get a little more information on that period. And this is from 200 BC, a bronze statuette. You can definitely see how beautiful this form is, and how the Hellenistic characteristic of the veiled shawl that's forming the body, and this was a very in vogue at the time. That's really a characteristic of Hellenistic work. But you can definitely see how that bronze provides a great kind of surface and glows. And of course, it being metal, it was expensive, so it really was a very precious object when you had these kind of small statuette sculptures. And this is a lot of times where it was prior to it being large pieces. So a lot of these early bronze pieces were done in a time where bronze was very expensive. So you had a lot of smaller work rather than a lot of larger colossal pieces in comparison to what they were doing in stone at the time. So let's go ahead and go to the definition here. Casting. Casting is an invention of the Bronze Age, beginning approximately 2500 BCE, when it was first utilized to make various utensils by simply pouring liquid bronze into open-face molds. So you can imagine just having some sand and scraping some lines in sand like you would at the beach, and then having molten bronze pour onto that sand, and then you have a pretty crude open face casting. That's a good example, a simple example of explaining an open face mold. The technology is not much more complicated than that of a gelatin mold, or like how you would make Jello and just pour it into a cupcake mold or something. You pour gelatin into a mold and let it harden. When you remove the gelatin, it is shaped like the inside of the mold, or the original modeled form, filling the mold with bronze and then breaking the mold away. So it's very similar to just pouring anything into a container and it solidifying. The enchanting bronze statuette of a veiled dancer, the image over here, introduces us to a wide variety of small-scale works produced for private ownership, which comprise a special category unto themselves. They are often called tanagra figures, which is the site where many have been found. Like vase paintings, they show a range of subject matter far broader than that of the monumental sculpture, such as beggars, street entertainers, peasants, and young ladies of fashion. So you can really see how interesting these could be to look at. Go ahead and click on that image, because there are so many of these that they found, and all different types of characters. So you really kind of get to go back in time and see how everyday people were represented, because most of the time we think of bronzes, we think of like the gods or the pharaohs or the kings and queens of the time, but these Tanagra sculptures really are only really about kind of everyday life people. And on this other side here, we have Portrait of a Boy, which is early 3rd century BCE, and you can really see how for the time how they were really thinking about how, expression. Even in this kind of a very, very simple head here, there's a style and there's a interesting way that they use pattern and different types of simple geometric shapes to create that hair. And it's very interesting and delicate form that we're looking at here, and it's very old. So the technical ability not just to cast bronze this way, but also just to develop again a caricature or a signature way of working and way of depicting people around them. Let's read a little paragraph here. Towards 300 BCE, under the influence of Greek portraiture, that individual likeness began to appear in Etruscan sculpture. The finest of them are not funerary portraits, which tend to be rather crude and perfunctory, but the heads of bronze statues. Portrait of a Boy is a real masterpiece of its kind. The firmness of modeling lends a special poignancy to the sensitive mouth and the gentle melancholy eyes. So, this is all characteristics of the time. So if you look at a lot of the bronzes from this era, that was the ideal person. That was the ideal state of their sense of the human, of the human condition. So very early bronze pieces, but more importantly, they're casting, they're modeling, and they're going through a process of transferring that clay form into another material, which gives it a whole other life after you work with the clay and then you cast in another material such as bronze. It's reborn, and it does change the feel of the sculpture. This next gallery slide here are old diagrams, old etchings of a large equestrian statue showing the process of bronze casting as it was done at the time. And this specific piece here, these etchings were done in 1767. And you can see how there is a skeletal structure on the farthest left side of the photo of a horse skeleton structure. Nowadays we use metal and welders. Back then it was probably wood or different types of bronze rod that they had. And then the center image here, you see a mold being made that's a kind of a geometric shapes that are falling over the clay form. You could assume that the rider and the horse are made out of clay at that point. And you see all the sections that they have to make, all the mold sections in order to create something that complicated. So just imagine the skill level that they had. Remember, this goes all the way back to the Greek era, so very finely skilled. They didn't have anything synthetic when it has come for like silicone rubbers or anything like that we use now in mold making processes. It was all done out of plaster or piece molds, as you can see in this diagram. And then the next one you see is a plumbing system or a sprue or a wax rod system being placed on the casting, which would then be at wax. So just kind of some cool old drawings showing how they did it way back in the day. And honestly, there's only one way you can really do that. These days we have some technological advances, but still 90% of bronze casting is still done in this way because not very many materials can withstand the 2500 degree temperature that bronze pours at, super hot temperature. Let's go to the paragraph here. The lost wax process, and please click on that video link there because there is a video of an actual process there. It's a pretty cool one. Also known as cire Purdue, was perfected by the Greeks, if not actually invented by them. Because metal is both expensive and heavy, a technique had to be developed to create hollow images rather than solid ones. And again, that's why metal has different properties, or bronze has different properties, or sculptural opportunities than stone, is because you can make it thin, and that thinness is still very, very strong. Okay. from the Encyclopedia of Science, the Liberal Arts, and the Mechanical Arts, compiled in the 18th century by the French encyclopedist, art critic, dramatist, and writer Denis Diderot. These latter images depict the castings of a mounted figure from the French King Louis XIV, which was actually erected in Paris in 1699. So that's just little information on these pieces here. But what it is lost wax process. This is an old ancient technique with just some pretty cool diagrams that were done in the the 18th century. And here is a diagram showing from beginning to end a pretty simplistic mold making process or lost wax process for the casting of bronze. And you can see here a number on letter A, you have the clay modeled form, and it goes on to a series of mold making processes, even being broken down into sections. You can see on letter C how the sections on every limb is a different mold. And then on letter D, it is in spin around, right? Because you want to pour wax into it and get a good cast of wax. And then you put the wax together in letter F. You pin it together, sculpt it all back together again, and then so on into G, where you apply a plumbing system so you can transfer the bronze throughout the whole form. H is where you have an investment material. Typically, it would be crushed pottery and plaster that you encase it in, and then in I, you heat that up, and that wax does melt out, leaving the negative space, or the core, or where there was wax, is no longer. It's a negative space where you then in J can pour into that investment the bronze, and then you can see in K you have a bronze piece with all the bronze plumbing. It's all intact together because that's how it transfers throughout that investment. And then L, you polish it up into your final sculpture. Again, this is a very hard, very long process, but just a diagram. Let's go to the paragraph here. In the lost wax process, the sculpture is the first modeled in some soft pliable material such as clay, wax, or plaster in a putty state. This model looks just like the finished sculpture, but of course the material of which it is composed is nowhere near durable as metal. A mold is then made of the model. Today, a synthetic rubber is most commonly used to make this mold, and when it is removed, we are left with a negative impression of the original. In other words, something like a gelatin mold of the object. Molten wax is then poured or brushed for the final sculpture about an inch. The space inside the wax lining is filled with an investment, a mixture of water, plaster, and powder, and made up from ground pottery. So that investment here, going off the paragraph here, would be where number H starts, that white material encasing all over that wax sculpture, which would be G. G is just a wax sculpture, and then H is the investment made of that water, plaster, and powder from ground up pottery, which is actually called grog, Grog. The mold is then removed, and we are left with a wax casting identical to the original model that is filled with the investment material. Rods of wax are then applied to the wax casting, and that would be on G. You see on the letter G here on the diagram, they have the wax sprue before it's invested. They will carry off melted metal. They will carry off melted wax that it occurs during baking, and will eventually provide channels through which the molten bronze will be poured. So just a simplified diagram of the lost wax casting process. And here in this next gallery slide, we have more examples of the large equestrian statue and the old diagrams. Here on this side, you have, again, the sprueing system on that large sculpture. And it's kind of a cool image because the illustrator here who did this way back in 1767 kind of cut the sculpture in half to kind of show you the interior structure of how they would have done the plumbing or the wax rod system. Again, those wax rods are, think of them as plumbing pipes that just filter or provide the molten bronze to the different parts of the interior of the mold to have a successful casting. And then on the next image, you can see the investment being made, which is that plaster and water and that ground up pottery around it. and encasing the whole form. And then the image is a studio shot of our studio here at Mount Hood Community College, where I have a sculpture here that I've sprued up with the red rod, which is red wax, and the brown wax, or the darker wax, is the sculpture. So you see all that will be bronze. Let's go to the paragraph here. This wax cast with its wax channels, or those wax rods, is now ready to be covered with an outer mold of investment. In the left image, we see a cutaway of the wax cast surrounded by the investment. When this outer mold cures, it is then baked in a kiln at a temperature of 1500 degrees with the wax replica inside it. Wax rods melt, providing channels for the rest of the wax to run out as well, hence the term lost wax. A thin space where the wax once was now lies empty between an inner core and the outer core mold, or the outer mold. The separation maintained by the bronze pins. The left shows the burnout mold ready to be lowered into the casting pit, and its exterior reinforced by iron bands. So, again, this is all trying to kind of illustrate these really cool drawings here, but in a sense, the video that you should have seen in the previous slide will show you a little bit more of the process in detail. And in this gallery slide, you see some examples of a pouring of the bronze into the investments. The two images on the left-hand side are from the Mount Hood Community College studio, and you can see the pourer here with the handles pouring the crucible filled with molten bronze into those cylindrical white plaster investment forms. And then the image below it is a sculpture being divested, or when you break apart the plaster in grog, or the broken pottery investment, you break that open and then reveal the bronze casting inside it. And you can see how the plumbing or the sprues are still attached, and all that is ground off and cut off with saws and different types of things. The next image over here is another illustration of how they would have poured it in the time of this illustration, which is 1767. And you can definitely see how it's an orchestra of events happening, and probably was something to see of the time because of how large these pieces were, and just how heavy bronze is and how hot it is. So just a really cool image of the pour in that era. Let's go to the paragraph here. Pouring bronze. In the image on the right side, the bronze pour is about to take place. The casting pit is located beneath the foundry floor, where the mold is encased in sand. And you can see in the image where we're pouring at Mount Hood Community College that the investments are encased in sand. So that's a traditional way. And in the illustration here, there is a sand pit right in front of that little door where they're kind of pulling that chain from. A large box in the background in the furnace where the bronze is melted. Molten bronze is poured into the casting gate, the large opening on the top of the mold directly in front of the furnace, filling the cavity where the wax once was. And you can see where the bronze is being poured in that image in the top corner. That is the casting gate, right? It's like a funnel shaped form. So you have a big opening to pour all that bronze into. Hence, many people refer to casting as a replacement method. Bronze replaces wax. When the bronze has cooled, the mold and the investment are removed, and we are left with a bronze replica of a wax form, complete with the lattice work of rods. And that's the example of below the casting image. You can see that upside down head. I think you can make out the nose and the chin, and maybe a couple eyes there. The rods are cut from the bronze cast, and the surface is smooth and finished. And below is a great image. Again, remember, you can click on these images to see more detail of Constantine Brancusi's Mademoiselle Pugamine number 2, 1919. So eventually you can see how throughout the generations, when we hit into 1919, how the forms were getting way more complex. We're getting into a lot more expressive, a lot more free form abstraction and dissection of the body. And of course, all this eventually influenced everything from anime to, all types of forms that we're used to now, even ergonomics and car design and all that. Constantine Brancusi is a great example of how the 20th century was a big step forward in the progression of form and shape for not only sculpture, but sculpture, remember, does influence industry later on down the line. So good examples here and good images of how the last part of the process, which is to pour the bronze into the mold after the mold has been burnt out and all the wax has been lost or burnt out, hence the name, the lost wax process. Next, here we have is assemblage. And assemblage is simply can be defined as when we aren't modeling or making the forms, the artist isn't making or sculpting like you would do with clay, a shape or a symbol or a representational image, but we're actually finding everyday objects, things around your environment that mean something to you, and you begin to combine them and elevate original intent or their original being into a metaphor or a symbol simply by combining them with other materials. And a good example of that is this piece here by David Hammons titled Spade with Chains from 1973. And what's interesting about this piece is that you can compare it to Michelangelo's Atlas slave sculptures that we saw in the beginning of the slideshow, because both pieces are talking about pretty much the same subject matter of the slave. With Damon Havens, he's an African American artist who deals with the subject of civil rights and the systemic racism that exists in the country. So his metaphor of the slave relates to Michelangelo's statement of the slave, but just done with different formulas. Michelangelo using the subtractive method of the stone of carving, and David Hammons using the assemblage method of combining objects, both with the same statement. And you can see, let's go to the definition of assemblage here. Many of the same thematic concerns that we saw in Michelangelo's Atlas slave are at work in David Hammond's Spade with Change, with the right image here. Both specifically address the issues of enslavement. By means of assemblage is creating sculpture by compiling objects taken from the environment. Hammonds has combined found materials, a common spade and a set of chains, into a face that recalls an African mask. The piece represents a wealth of transformations. Just as Michelangelo could see the raw block of stone, the figure within, Hammonds can see in the most common materials of everyday life the figures of his world. This transformation of common materials of everyday life, the figures of his world, this transformation of common materials into art is a defining characteristic of assemblage. As a process, assemblage invokes the myth of the phoenix, the bird that, consumed by fire, is reborn out of its own ashes. That rebirth, or rejuvenation, is also expressed at a cultural level in Hammond's work. And that's a great way of explaining assemblage work, is taking something that has been thrown away or taking metaphors and things around you, right, and elevating them into a symbol or a meaning because you are poetically combining them with other materials. It's no longer a shovel or a spade. It is a head and a statement towards African American heritage, and it has all these layers of meaning because of the use of the shovel, which is digging a hole. That was primarily what the slaves did in the South with the cotton agriculture and the sugarcane agriculture. So it's layered with symbolism, and Hammonds is a master of combining these items to create a larger meaning of them. Let's go to the smaller definition over here. The transformation of the materials of slave labor, the spade and the chain, into a mask is an affirmation of the American slave's African heritage. The richness of this transformation is embodied in the double meaning of the word spade, at once a racist epitaph and the appropriate name of the object in question. So that's interesting, right? So it's both a racist epitaph, right, but also the appropriate name of the object in question. That in itself is a layered metaphor there, meaning that everyday objects are named to certain cultures very offensive things that you just have to live with, in this kind of society. But faced with this image, it is no longer possible. In the words of a common cliche, to call a spade, right? The piece literally illustrates us from that simple and reductive possibility. So it turns into a very conceptual statement, right? So assemblage can be a very powerful way of making art. And that is what we're going to be doing in your assignment in this slideshow is trying to assemble something with meaning from everyday objects in your own personal environment. And lastly, here we have land art or earthworks, and which is also a very ancient process and an ancient practice that humans have been practiced for for thousands of years. We have a lot of mysterious land art works that are so large and so well done that only you can only experience it if you were flying over it. But artists in the modern era have utilized this concept as well, and honestly think of it as a tradition to continue on. That the human has always made massive land art. It's been happening for thousands of years. Uh, and some of those contemporary artists are, for example, like Christo and Jean Claude, right? The umbrellas from Japan and the USA in 1984, where it was just massive expanse of these huge umbrellas. And the photo here doesn't give it the scale of the umbrellas any justice, but these umbrellas were probably over between 20 and 30 feet tall. So they were massive umbrellas, and thousands of them scattered throughout the landscape for only a period of time, and all done very ecologically, and all done very done in a way that it wouldn't damage any of the environment around it. But you can definitely see how effective it is and how amazing it is to continue the tradition of making art that involve the landscape, that involve actually altering or adjusting or aesthetically dealing with the landscape or the earth as a whole. Uh, let's go to the definition here. Land art earthworks, the larger the work, the more our visual experience of it depends on multiple points of view. Since the late 1960s, one of the focuses of modern sculpture has been the creation of large-scale out-of-door environment, generally referred to as land art or earthworks. Christo's umbrellas and Robert Smithson's spiral jetty are classic examples of the medium, as is Walter de Maria's lightning field. As the lines drawn on the landscape in the Nazca, Peru indicate, humans have set out to sculpt the landscape and to impose sculpture into the landscape since the earliest times. And you can click on that link of Nazca, Peru, to you can see some of the Nazca lines that are still a very mysterious thing that we have on that we don't know much about. So again, this has been happening for thousands of years. Below the Christo and Jean-Claude umbrella piece, we have Robert Smithson's famous spiral jetty from 1970, and which is created from the local Utah mud, precipitated salt, crystals, rock, and water, and it's about 1,500 feet long. And what's interesting about this piece is that it reacts physically with the salt and the water because of what he has put in that the land, and this is huge. You can walk in it. He used a bulldozer to make this piece, so it kind of changes colors because of the things that happen with the Great Salt Lake and all its various changes that happens with its drying year, its dry season, and the wet season. So again, you're talking about a piece of work that's going to last a long, long time. And in order for you to experience this piece, you yourself have to take a journey to go experience this piece. So it's almost like experiencing art through journey, through pilgrimage, through having to invest time, energy, and your amount of life to go experience this piece of work, like you would to go see a mountain or go hike a trail. So again, it's taking that art out of the museum, out of the gallery, and reacting with a lot different senses than you would if you were just to look at this as a painting or as a sculpture in a church or something. Over here we have Walter de Maria's Lightning Field, which is an amazing piece in a town called Quemado, New Mexico. And Quemado means to burn in Spanish, which is simply a set of stainless steel poles that are really tall, about 20 feet, and they go into for miles. And you can see the dimensions of this piece, which is 5,200 by 3,300 feet. So it's a large spot of land that this sculpture takes on. But you can stand out there and just see the lightning just react to these lightning rods, right? So really dealing with art and drawing and painting just with land and elements. So you can see how art has evolved into this cycle, right, of magnificent figurative representational sculpture all the way to trying to connect with the ancient land art sculptures of the Inca and of course the Egyptian and of course all the mysterious Northern European land art that we don't know much about. So artists still continue the tradition of large earthworks. And here we have a gallery slide of land art and earthworks. And good examples, again, are some artists. This specific artist here is named Michael Heitzer, and he has a piece at the top left corner here titled Double Negative, where he carved into a side of a plateau or a mesa a large rectangular shape that meets the other side. And what's interesting about this piece here is that he made sure that the length of it is the exact same length as the Empire State Building to give it some sort of spatial context. So, and you can really see how something as massive as an Empire State Building is dwarfed in the landscape of the American West. I believe this is somewhere in Nevada. So, having some interesting spatial combinations and architectural comparisons here. But then again, you have to take this pilgrimage to go out and see this piece, right? Let's go into the paragraph here. The issue with site specificity reached its most extreme expression. And site specificity is another way of saying land art, where for a piece of work is specific to the land that it resides in. That this piece will only work out in the Mesa Desert of Nevada. So that's what site specificity means. Again, you can click on these links to get more information. In the work of Michael Heitzer, who pioneered the new genre of site-specific art that defines itself in a precise interaction with the particular place for which it was conceived. Heitzer had come from a family of geologists and archaeologists and grew up in Northern California and Nevada, where he developed a great affinity for the landscape of the West. In 1966, at the age of 21, he came to New York for a year and a half and then went out to the Nevada desert to begin doing dirt work projects in 1967. He began with temporary work such as trenches, drawing with his motorcycle tracks, and dispersals of pigment and soil. So here's the video link here. We can get some more information on Michael Heitzer's work, but you can see him there in 1967 with these large kind of motorcycle rings. He just used a motorcycle to carve or draw into the landscape. So imagine that you have an idea that your canvas or your drawing or your paper needs to be acres big. It's no longer a large canvas or a building, right? It's something that needs space, that you need to go out there and find the land to make your drawing. So again, a whole other evolvement of sculpture. And then but again, remember, cycling into again ancient works that have been made for thousands of years.